of the Hutchins Library events. You're going to be in for a great story today and some great local and regional history. Our speaker, Mathew Parrish, is a graduate of Brevard College. He's a historian who is currently finishing up his master's degree in applied history at Eastern Kentucky University. So he's a full-time student. He works part-time as the site manager of Whitehall, and right now he's doing an archives internship right here in Hutchins Library. So a very busy young person who I think is going to go far in the field. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
Thank you. All right. Got to make sure I got my tour guide voice on. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Everybody in the back? Cool. All right. We're going to go from Tim's fantastic intro slide here and get started. All right. And can everybody see this okay? Okay. All right. So yes, I know Tim gave me an intro, but it's sort of part of my internal mind script to give an intro to. So I'm Mathew Parrish. I work at the Whitehall Historic Site in Richmond, which I've got a picture of it here. If any of y'all have ever been, it is a massive mansion here in Madison County, a bit north of the town of Richmond. It is the home of the Clay family here in Kentucky. The Clays were a very wealthy family. A lot of them were business people, politicians, and this house really shows that off. The home itself is a little over 10,000 square feet, and altogether there are 44 rooms inside the mansion. So it is a massive, massive place. But this is my my full-time job here. I work here at Whitehall. I got started a little over a year ago. I originally started as an intern here at Whitehall, but I actually got a job working full-time. So over the past year or so, I've been learning a lot about this guy named Cassius Clay, who was one of the last Clay family members to live here at the Whitehall Historic Site. But I grew up here in Berea. My parents were so nice to be here, work at Berea College, and so from an early time I had heard this name, Cassius Clay, and I also knew about John G. Fee, who of course started Berea College here. But not until a few years ago, I worked just during a summertime here at Berea College giving tours of the campus. I learned about Cassius Clay and John G. Fee and their relationship that they had together. So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Cassius Clay, John G. Fee, and how they got Berea started. So to kick things off, give you a little bit of background about what's going on here in Kentucky in terms of slavery here in the state. Kentucky, when it first becomes a state in 1792, it was designated a slave state. So slavery, the owning of enslaved people and the selling of enslaved people was legal. Around 1800, there started to be states, especially farther up north, that would start to be non-slave states, where laws would be put in place to try to fight against slavery. But Kentucky was not this way. I tried to do a little bit of math. I'm not too great of a mathematician. I'm more of a history guy. But between 1800 and 1860, roughly a quarter of the population in the state of Kentucky was enslaved. So just imagine that. Imagine 1 out of 4 people that you know would have been an enslaved person here in the state up until 1860. Kentucky, though, had some really unique laws about slavery that actually made it a little more, I won't say sort of liberal or ahead of its time, but it was different than other slave states that were farther south. One example being there was no laws against educating enslaved people. So it was actually legal for slave owners to educate their enslaved people, teach them how to read and how to write. Cassius Clay, the person I talked about at Whitehall, his father, a man named Green Clay, was a huge slave owner here in the state of Kentucky, and we actually have evidence that shows that he was actually teaching enslaved men how to read and write so they could be overseers for him. So he had, overseers who were enslaved men who did not get paid for what they did, but they knew how to read and write. Another interesting law about Kentucky in terms of slave laws is that there were no laws ever put in place that made it illegal to free enslaved individuals. Some states, especially South Carolina, really southern states, there were laws put in place where it made it difficult to try to emancipate people, but there were no laws like that in Kentucky. So even though Kentucky is a slave state, it's right on the border between North and South, and you get kind of a mixture between northern ideals and southern ideals. But the most important thing, and this has to do with our story today, is that Kentucky was a very divided state, even long before the Civil War. There were abolitionists here in the state. There were emancipationists who believed that slavery was bad, but they didn't necessarily believe in abolition. And there were slave owners all occupying not only the same state, but in a lot of cases, even the same city. And what made it even more interesting and sort of, made it a little bit more interesting is that even some emancipationists were also slave owners. So you got people who were sort of mixed in between the two cases. So that's sort of a prelude to what we're going to talk about. This picture, real quick, I know it's a bit blurry, but it is a photograph of the Cheapside auction site in Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington became one of the biggest cities in the state, and therefore it had one of the largest auction blocks here in the state. So this is a picture of that auction area where enslaved people would have been sold in downtown Lexington. So that gets us to our first character, John Greg Fee. If anyone, I'm sure Berea folks have seen this photograph before. So we're going to talk about how Fee and Cassius are similar. So starting with Fee, Fee was born in Bracken County, northern Kentucky, in 1816. He was born to a slave-owning family. His father was a slave owner, owned property as well. But he started going to school as a young man, and he eventually attended Lane Theological Seminary School in Cincinnati in 1842. So John G. Fee, as he starts to grow up, he wants to get involved with the church. He wants to become a reverend. So an important thing happens when he's up in Ohio. He's away now from the southern states. He's away from the slave state of Kentucky. He's able to be around more people who are anti-slavery, and he really starts to take on a lot of these ideas, not just emancipationist ideas, but full-on abolitionist. So by the time Fee gets done with his education, he comes back here to Kentucky, and he is an abolitionist. He denounces slavery. An interesting thing that happened with Fee is that he was given land in Indiana by his father to own, but he decided to sell that land to actually buy the freedom of a woman who raised him, Juliet Myers, who was basically an enslaved woman that raised him as a child. So we'll go on to more of his sort of political views. So Fee was an abolitionist. He thought slavery was evil. He thought it was a sin. He thought it to end immediately. He thought that if you were a slave owner, that meant that you were not a Christian. You needed to end slavery immediately. Fee, it's really amazing his sort of commitment to ending slavery. I get a lot of his ideas from sort of a memoir that he wrote later on in his life, and he talks about in his memoirs about having a moment when he realized that this was it. He was an anti-slavery guy, he was an abolitionist, and it meant that basically his life was essentially over. He had to cut ties with his family, friends. He eventually ended up getting married, but at this point he thought that he would never be married. He'd be moving around all the time. Nobody would like him. He sort of had this awakening moment where he knew he was going to be dead to the world, and he sort of accepted that. So that really kind of shows you what being a person like Fee in Kentucky in the 1840s, 1850s was like. You had to be prepared to not only be unpopular, but possibly die if you were going to have these sort of ideas. So Fee sold this land. He is not a slave owner. He keeps trying to convince his father to free slaves as well, and his father sort of denounces him and doesn't want to have anything to do with him. But he also uses some of the money that he got from selling land to create a pamphlet, an anti-slavery pamphlet that was designed to be given to slave owners. It was sort of like I know this sounds weird, but almost like a how-to book, how to free enslaved people, trying to show that it can be done. This is how we can do it. And he, while doing this, would travel around Kentucky preaching anti-slavery ideas. He would go to town. Some small town would sort of hire him to be a reverend for a little while, and as soon as he'd open his mouth, the town would kick him out. So he really travels around from place to place, and Fee, in his early days, just can't really find a solid place to set up a congregation, a place to set up a church and spread his ideas. But he eventually would, and it was by the help of the next guy we'll talk about, Cassius Marcellus Clay. What a name, right? Very sort of Greek. Cassius is a lot like Fee. He's born in Kentucky. He's actually born here in Madison County, in Richmond. And he was also born into a slave-owning family. His father, Green Clay, I mentioned earlier, is one of the largest slave owners in the state's history. He was born in 1810. After his father died, he was 18 years old. He was given land and enslaved people to own his father's will. Isn't that crazy to think? People were in wills, back in this time period. It was actually in the same part of the will that included furniture. So basically, you're giving away your possessions. Some of those possessions were people. So Cassius was a slave owner for a certain amount of time. However, that same year that his father died and he became a slave owner, he starts going to college. He started off by going to Transylvania University up in Lexington, Kentucky. He went there for 3 years, started to get a law degree. He finished up his law degree by going to Yale College, farther up north. And again, it's just like Fee. He leaves the South, he goes up to the North, and he starts to latch on to these anti-slavery ideas. He would go to talks and lectures given by abolitionists of the time period, like Frank Lloyd Wright. So he started getting a lot of these ideas and really took them to heart. By the time he gets done with his education, like Fee, he comes back here to Kentucky and starts spreading these anti-slavery ideas. And he also began to emancipate slave people that his father left him. But here's the big difference between Cassius and Fee. Cassius is not an abolitionist. He's an emancipationist. He doesn't believe in immediate abolition. So it took him a long time to emancipate all the people that his father had left him in his will. Cassius's thing in terms of slavery is a lot different than Fee's. Even though they're both very similar, they're also very different. Cassius didn't really have necessarily a problem with equal rights and that sort of thing. His thing was that slavery was an unfair economic system. While Cassius had been going to college up at Yale, he had traveled a couple of northern cities, and he had commented in his own memoirs that he wrote later on in his life that he saw these giant northern cities with massive buildings and people making tons of money, but there were no slaves. So he thought that sort of the way forward for Kentucky, for the South, was not to keep slavery, but to do away with slavery and embrace industrialization, just like the North had. So Cassius was sort of an industrialist. He thought that the slavery system was outdated. It was economically unfair because it let people, like his father, have all the land and all the power in the community, and it left a bunch of poor white farmers with nothing else. So Cassius wanted to sort of equalize the playing field, give more land to poor farmers, and industrialize. He knew that there were resources in eastern Kentucky like coal and lumber, and he thought that the state hadn't taken advantage of that because they were stuck in this old slavery system. So that was sort of Cassius's anti-slavery ideas. He, unlike Fee, he did become a politician. In 1835, he got elected to the Kentucky State House, where he was there for only about 3 terms. He was there for 6 years. After his last term, he was really getting into his anti-slavery ideas, and he just became so unpopular. People quit voting for him, really, because other politicians just hated him for his anti-slavery ideas. So we've got these two characters. We've got Cassius, who no politicians like him, so he can't get his ideas across. And we have Fee, who can't get a church, so he can't get his ideas across. So they eventually meet. And it starts off with this true American newspaper. So Cassius in 1845 got the idea to start a newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky, that would spread these anti-slavery ideas around the city and hopefully around the state to try to change people's minds, and especially get poor white farmers angry about slavery so they would start voting for people like Cassius and get rid of slavery in Kentucky. So in 1845, he starts this anti-slavery newspaper. He met Fee in the 1840s, and Fee and Cassius, their relationship sort of started off by Fee writing a little bit for this newspaper, The True American. One thing that happens with The True American, this is a photograph of the building that was in downtown Lexington. It's no longer there, it had a fire. But because of its, what people thought of radical ideas, and because it was only a few blocks away from where enslaved people were being sold in downtown Lexington, mobs would start forming outside of the True American newspaper. So, Cassius, being Cassius Clay, took some precautions and he bought a cannon. This is a picture of his actual cannon. It's at Whitehall, so if you come out to Whitehall, you can actually see it. It's a 2-pounder cannon, and according to Cassius' memoir, he bought not one but two and put them downstairs pointed at the front doors of the newspaper office. And this is his own words, he loaded them with nails. In case a mob tried to break into the building, he could light the fuse off and blow the whole place up. So you can probably tell it was not a very popular thing. Actually, a mob eventually did break in and destroy the True American newspaper office. Luckily for them, Cassius had typhoid fever and was not there. Probably would have gone down differently if he was. But only, look at this, only a few months, June, July, August, just 2 months after the newspaper started, a mob broke into the newspaper office. They dismantled the newspaper press, and they actually took it and put it on a train bound for Cincinnati. That was telling them to get out. So this really shows you what politics is like in the 1840s in Kentucky. If you had anything to say that was anti-slavery, you were going to be most likely met with violence, met with mob rule. And the crazy thing about this mob is that they were actually legally allowed to go inside and dismantle this private newspaper office. They went to a local judge and got a warrant that allowed them to go inside because it was disrupting the local peace of the community. So this is the kind of thing that Cassius and Fee are up against at this time period. But it's not just mobs who are banging on a newspaper office. Cassius and Fee were met with violence on a couple of occasions. So if anybody knows anything about Cassius Clay, they know him for the fights that he gets into. Before I talk about them, I love this quote from Cassius. This comes from his memoirs. This has to do here with the mob that broke into the newspaper office. Cassius, while he's sick in bed, he gets a note from the mob saying that they're going to break in and destroy the newspaper office if he doesn't shut it down. And he sent a very, Cassius-like note back, and he says, go tell your secret conclave of cowardly assassins that Cassius Marcellus Clay knows his rights and how to defend them. That was the note that he sent back. So even before the True American newspaper office, though, Cassius, as a politician, is meeting a lot of violence because of his opinions. In 1841, he actually got into a duel over slavery. There was another politician who was more sort of a slavery advocate, and both him and Cassius had started arguing, and eventually this politician mentioned Cassius' wife's name in a speech. So Cassius challenged him to a duel. Neither men were hurt, but he did have a duel over slavery. 1843, he was in Lexington giving a speech when a man stood up in the crowd and called Cassius a liar and pulled out a pocket pistol and shot him in the chest. Luckily for Cassius, he was often carrying a Bowie knife, just like this one we see here. This is an actual one that belonged to him. It's at Whitehall. And according to him, it was the luckiest thing in the world. The knife had a silver sheath, and the bullet hit the sheath and caught the bullet, saving Cassius' life. Cassius talks about it in his memoirs. After being shot, figuring out he's still alive, he pulls out his Bowie knife and he carved this man's face up. Actually, according to him, he cut off an ear and one of his nose and gouged out one of his eyes. A couple years later, 1849, Cassius was again giving a speech about anti-slavery, and again somebody in the crowd called Cassius a liar and hit him, and Cassius went to go pull out his Bowie knife, but this man who hit him, a man named Cyrus Turner, had 5 other of his brothers with him. So Cassius, in this situation, was attacked by 6 people all at once. They were beating him with canes, hitting him with chairs. Somebody pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the abdomen and punctured one of his lungs. Cassius somehow survived and got out of this melee and actually killed another one of the Jews. So imagine this. This is supposed to be a political speech going on. And there's just massive, this crazy battle that happens. So even being Cassius having these not necessarily completely radical ideas, he was still met with a lot of violence in the 1840s. But so was Fee. Fee talks about in his memoirs about constantly being taken by mobs. He would get attacked by mobs, and they would try to walk him outside of the county and try to kick him out, but somehow he would always come back. In 1856, he had been kidnapped by a mob, and their idea was to take him outside the county. He was in Rockcastle County, and they were going to take him to Lincoln County and possibly kill him once he got out of the county there. But it's a fantastic story. As Fee is being walked by this mob out of the county, he's preaching the whole time. He's got his Bible with him. We saw that picture of him holding his Bible. So the whole time as this mob is walking him out of the county, he's preaching all these ideas, and sure enough, people start leaving the mob. It gets to a situation where they stop at somebody's house because it's raining, and Fee got up on a table and started giving them a sermon, and by the time the rain stopped, 7 people had left. So by the time Cassius gets to outside the county, there's only 6 men left, and they feel really bad for kidnapping Fee, and they decided to give him a glass of water, and he walked back home. So another one, though, that was a little bit more dangerous was in 1858. Fee, with a person that he worked with named Robert Jones, had been giving a sort of a sermon in Rockcastle County here in Madison County, when a mob attacked them and tried to drag them outside of the county. They were brought to the Kentucky River, and Fee's sort of person he worked with, Robert Jones, was nearly beaten to death with canes. And this is the craziest thing about Fee. When they turned to Fee and said, "Okay, it's your turn," he took his shirt off and just got down on his knees and said, "I am yours." So, and actually upon this happening, the mob was just in silence, in awe, and somebody called out, "Don't hurt him." And another person called out, "Don't hurt him." And so finally they all agreed that they just let him go. And again, he just walked back home. Fee was, I couldn't figure out the date, but Fee claims he was also shot at while he was in his house here in Berea, and several occasions he is beaten by mobs. He has stones thrown at him while he walks down the streets, and he was also, of course, thrown out of several churches as well physically. So it was a dangerous time to be, especially somebody like Fee. But I have to have a quote from Fee here. This is from when a mob was going to come and get him. He had been told by one of his friends, "There's this mob coming, you've got to get out of town." And John G. Fee, being Fee, said, "I came here to do my duty, and when the mob shall come, they will find me at my post." So this was Fee's post, and he was not going to leave. So despite all of this violence, Cassius and Fee somehow still survive, and they start working together to try to end slavery, despite the true American now being gone. So this is really where Berea gets its start. So Cassius had this idea of trying to spread anti-slavery ideas by creating a whole community, a whole sort of town where there would be no slave owners. And this was, nothing against Cassius, but pretty clever as a politician, because he also comes up with this idea at the same time when people stop voting for him. So what better way to get more votes as a politician than to start your whole town where everybody will vote for you? So Cassius gets this idea to start basically his own town where everybody's going to follow him and vote for him. He'd be able to hopefully get back in the Kentucky State House. It never happened, but this was his idea. So Cassius makes an offer to Fee. He knows Fee is traveling around. He can't really find a permanent spot. So he basically tells Fee, "Okay, I've got a bunch of land in southern Madison County. I'm going to give some of that land to you. Start a church. Get people to come and congregate around you, and we'll start an anti-slavery community together." So Fee is on board. Cassius donates $200 so Fee can start building his house and a couple other buildings, and 10 acres of land. He donated that in 1853. 1854, Fee starts his church, and in 1855, he started his school. The school would, of course, become what Berea College is now today. Fee had, in Ohio, met a lot of people at colleges like Oberlin, so when the school gets started, he invites people who have the same sort of anti-slavery ideas that he does to come down to Kentucky and start, going to his church and also start teaching classes. So the school, though, was really, really important, not just for Fee, but for Cassius, too. Both of them, another similarity was that they knew that the only way that slavery is going to end here in Kentucky is by education. We have to change the education system. We have to change also the system of how work is done in Kentucky. So, of course, here at Berea, students work for their tuition, right? So this was part of the founding ideas of Berea College. The idea that both Cassius and Fee had is that it's okay to work. It's okay to do labor. It shouldn't be considered lowly or slaves' work, as they would have called it. To be a whole person, you should be able to have a craft, have a skill, and according to Fee, you should also study the Bible and be religious. So their idea was to change the idea of work and education here in Kentucky to try to get people's minds changed about slavery. Do away with the system of you're a wealthy person, you go to college to be a lawyer or a doctor, and then you own slaves. No, you could go to college and study, pottery or be a brickmaker, that kind of thing. Change the entire way that the structure of labor and education was in Kentucky. That's what they were trying to do. So, of course, a lot of Berea people here, you most likely know, Berea was the first integrated school and the first coeducational school in the South. And this is a really important thing that not necessarily get glossed over, but it's really important to point out. This was a school where black students were going to get an education before the Civil War. Kentucky was still a slave state. There were enslaved people laboring around Berea when Berea was existing, and black students were getting an education. That's just mind-blowing. There's nothing like that going on in Kentucky or really in the South at all. And again, Cassius' idea and Fee's idea attack the idea of slavery from within the slave state. That's how we're going to end this thing. So it sounds like things are going well. Look at these Berea students, these young minds who are going to grow up and think slavery's bad and they'll have an education. Cassius and Fee are working well together. Fee is this driving person who is, of course, dedicated to the idea of ending slavery. Cassius not only is dedicated to the idea of ending slavery, he also has a lot of influence, he has a lot of money, a lot of land, and there's also several occasions where Cassius started sending guards down here to Berea to protect Fee so that Fee would not be disturbed while he was trying to preach his ideas. So everything's going great until 1856. So in 1855, it may have started before this, but in the 1850s, Cassius starts to be kind of controlling over Fee. They're very different in terms of their anti-slavery ideas. Again, Cassius emancipationist, Fee abolitionist. There's a letter that's here in the archives from Cassius to Fee, where he's basically giving him critiques about what he needs to change about himself. One of them is to not use offensive language while giving sermons, and also to avoid gesticulation. So apparently Fee would be stomping his feet whenever he would give sermons. That's one thing Cassius talks about and wants Fee to stop doing. Because despite being a guy who would get into a duel over slavery, Cassius is afraid of Fee and wants him to be calmer. He wants to be more friendly in terms of trying to change ideas of slavery within the state of Berea. And so they're still working together, but Cassius is starting to be a little bit critical. But then in 1856, things get bad. It was 4th of July, and here in town, the college, or the school, was going to have a 4th of July celebration where people, founding members of the school, would give speeches. So Cassius and Fee are sort of at this podium here, and Cassius Clay, being the politician that he is, insists that Fee goes first. Please, Mr. Fee, please go first. And Fee says, no, I don't want to go first, because according to his memoirs, he knew Cassius was going to try to make a point out of him in the public. Cassius said, no, I insist. Please, Mr. Fee, please go first. And Fee, being Fee, he couldn't back down. He says, all right. Fee got up in front of the crowd, preached his ideas: friendship, love, treat others how you want to be treated, end slavery immediately, Fee kind of things. He gets down from the podium, and Cassius comes up afterwards and destroys Fee in front of his people, in front of his church. He starts critiquing Fee. He starts saying that, yes, slavery is bad, but we can't really do anything about it because it's still legal. He sort of denounces Fee's sort of ideas of slavery in terms of it being a thing about faith, which is kind of crazy because he's a reverend. You'd think that was sort of a basic thought of his. So basically comes out and publicly denounces Fee in front of everybody, gets down from the stage, and Fee is just enraged. It really didn't help their relationship. Cassius had been critical a little bit before, but this was an embarrassment to Fee. Followers of Fee were really upset about it as well. So this is where things really start to change here in Berea. The breakup of the friendship of Cassius and John G. Fee. We'll get back to that in a second, but there's some other things that also start happening here in Kentucky. For one thing, starting in the 1840s, there was a huge fear among slave owners of mass revolts of enslaved people here in the state of Kentucky. 1848, there was this movement where almost 75 enslaved people escaped together, and they attempted to escape from Kentucky across the Ohio River into Ohio. John G. Fee, being from Berea County, which is where some of the escaped enslaved people was accused of being involved. There's no evidence that actually shows that he was, especially the fact that people were claiming that he was smuggling guns. Fee was very against violence, but Fee claimed that he was not involved. But a really interesting thing is that a man named Jack, who was enslaved by the Clay family, was actually part of this movement to get away from Kentucky and escape into Ohio. Jack was caught and arrested for intent to kill with a pistol. So things like this are happening in Kentucky. There are large escapes of enslaved people. Slave owners are very fearful of revolts happening where they could be killed. And that really comes to sort of a boiling point when this guy comes into the picture. I always have to ask, does anybody know who this is? Okay, we've got some history people know. Okay. So who is this? John Brown. Okay. So 1856, John Brown starts his anti-slavery sort of quest. John Brown was out in Kansas, and if any of y'all heard the term bleeding Kansas, where there was sort of this border war going on, sort of a prelude to the Civil War. There was a lot of violence between settlers out in Kansas who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery. There was a lot of violence against these factions out in Kansas, but John Brown sort of came up out of nowhere, and like all sort of great, like all very interesting leaders, he claimed that he was a disciple of God and that it was his quest to abolish slavery. He went about this in a much more violent way than Fee was. He started off by getting his sons together, and they would go around to slave owners' houses and kill them with swords. So John Brown is going around in Kansas doing this sort of thing, and finally, in 1859, he tries to lead a revolt that goes into Virginia to a place called Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is where the sort of National Arsenal was. So John Brown's idea was to capture the guns of the National Arsenal, get enslaved people involved, get poor farmers involved, and try to end slavery national-wide here and now. John Brown's actions, they didn't end up playing out. He was captured, his sons were killed, almost everyone involved was killed. Interesting fun fact, the colonel that captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry was Robert E. Lee, the one who would become a big Civil War general. So John Brown, he's national-wide news. This is sort of the worst fear of every slave owner throughout the South, including Kentucky. So after the 4th of July speeches, Cassius actually stopped protecting Fee. I mentioned earlier that he would send guards down to Berea to try to guard Fee. He actually took those guards away after their falling out happened. So around this time period, Fee starts to get attacked again, and he doesn't have Cassius to protect him. 1859, a mob forms again, and it was because Fee had been giving a sermon after the John Brown incident had happened, and had said that the violence that John Brown was a part of was inexcusable. However, what he's doing is good. That's what we need in Kentucky to end slavery. He actually said we need more John Browns. He didn't mean in terms of killing everybody, but all of these slave owners in the state took it that John G. Fee was about to lead a slave revolt, and he was going to kill everybody. So a mob of wealthy landowners from Richmond, they congregate at the courthouse, and they come here to Berea to try to break up the school once and for all. These little mobs that walk Fee outside of the county and then come back, this isn't working. We need to get everybody to leave. Fee was actually not at home when this mob gets together. This man and woman were J.A.R. Rogers. He was the principal of Berea before it really became a college. Him and his family were forced out, as well as a lot of other Berea families, and the students, of course, were also forced to leave as well. Basically, they ordered them, you need to leave now or else we are going to kill you. So this was really going to be the end of Berea. Fee is gone. Cassius is now out of the picture. He doesn't want anything to do with Berea. It is interesting. I did find a letter where Cassius wrote sort of a formal sort of public denouncement of what this mob did and said that they should have done that, but he never actually took any actual physical action to try to stop the mob or try to get Berea back. So maybe this was more of a political move amongst people amongst Berea. But this was really, as Bereans considered it, the end of the school. The school had to leave, the school had to end, all of the people involved had to leave. Other things continue to happen that keeps Berea from coming back. 1862, the Civil War is now going on. The Confederates invade from Kentucky and they raid Berea and they come into Richmond where they have a battle. So during the Civil War, John G. Fee was, again, he was sort of back to his old sort of ways of traveling around. He went to Camp Nelson. I have a photograph here of troops stationed at Camp Nelson where a lot of black soldiers enlisted. He was at Camp Nelson, but he would also travel around Kentucky and also farther up north trying to get more money to start Berea back. So even though the war isn't even over yet, John G. Fee is trying to get Berea to get started back. Cassius served as a Union general for a very brief period of time, but mostly during the 1860s, he was gone in Russia. Abraham Lincoln had appointed him ambassador to Russia, the foreign minister. So he was gone. He was in Russia the whole time, pretty much. And I don't know if him and Fee ever wrote. I won't say that they didn't, but we, at least here at the archives, don't have any letters from most of the 1860s between John G. Fee and Cassius Clay. But important thing to know, though, in terms of Berea was that Kentucky remained part of the Union during the Civil War. So being part of the Union, whenever the Emancipation Proclamation passed, it did not affect Kentucky because it was not a Confederate state. So even while the Civil War was going on, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was still technically legal here in the state of Kentucky. So that made it really difficult to try to get Berea started again while the Civil War was going on. So things are looking pretty bad, but things start to get better. 1866, the war is of course over, and actually in 1865, earlier, John G. Fee had come back, a lot of Berea had come back, and they had basically started from where they left off. So Berea opened again as the Berea Literary Institute in 1866. A lot of the first students that came at that time period were actually people that Fee had met while at Camp Nelson, a lot of black soldiers who had met him. This man here, Angus Burley, he had been part of a artillery corps who had been at Camp Nelson during the Civil War. He had been a Civil War soldier, and after the war, he had actually met Fee at Camp Nelson. Fee told him all about this school that they're going to get started again. Come here and get a free education. So people like Angus Burley came to Berea after the Civil War. A lot of the early students after the war was over were these Civil War veterans. 1869, Berea becomes a college, and like I said, a lot of former enslaved people started to not only come to Berea to take classes, but they also started to live here in Berea. Before we move on, this is a great class photo of some early Berea students, and the kind of thing you would see in a newspaper here telling people to go to Berea College. So there's free tuition, it's a Christian school. People, previously enslaved people, after the war is over, they start coming back to Berea, and more people start coming to Berea. And an important thing about Berea was that it was selling plots of land to these families, and it sort of had a rule that races needed to live next to other races. So you couldn't have a white part of town and a black part of town. Everything needed to be mixed in together. I love this photograph here. This is of one of Berea's very early football. It wasn't really a team, but a club here. And you see there are black students and white students together, as well as this in this photo here. Berea became a town in 1890. And I think one of the really interesting things about Berea was that it had the largest sort of percentage of black-owned farms here in the state. 12.8% here in Madison County, whereas the percentage was much, much lower in the year 1900 elsewhere around the state. So, even though Cassius Clay is out of the picture, John G. Fee comes back and they really start off from where they left off, and Berea continues on. But not for very long. I'm sure a lot of people know the day law here, the Berea day law. So, to kind of end here, I'll talk about Cassius and Fee and their relationship after the Civil War, after Berea gets going again. Like I said, they really hadn't talked for a long, long time, but in the 1870s, they actually start writing to each other. And sure enough, they're being critical as always. Fee actually wrote Cassius, 1875. Cassius had been part of the Democratic Party, part of the Republican Party, but he decided to switch parties and he became a Democrat. Apparently, this really made Fee mad. We have a letter down in the archives, and Fee was very disappointed in Cassius and denounced him for joining the Democratic Party. A very interesting quote from Fee. He says something like, I don't like U.S. Grant any more than anybody else does, but the Republican Party is way, way better than the Democratic Party. So they're still sort of arguing, even though Berea's already started. But 1888, this was really interesting. We had a letter downstairs. John G. Fee was going to preach at a church in Richmond, and he invited Cassius and also his son, a man named Brutus Clay, to come and see him preach in Richmond. He said in his letter, I would love nothing better to look upon the face of Cassius Clay and your son. So me and Tim here have talked about this. Maybe they sort of needed each other. They're kind of the, maybe sort of a push-pull situation. Somebody like Cassius kind of needs somebody like John G. Fee, and Fee needs somebody like Cassius. It's almost like a frenemy sort of situation. They work together, they can both benefit off of each other, but then they can also feel good by critiquing the other person and knowing that they're the one who's right in any sort of situation. 1895, Cassius is getting pretty old. He would have looked something like this here. He wrote Berea's president, William Frost, the third president of Berea College, a very strongly written letter saying that Berea was pretty much all of his idea, and reminded Frost that he donated the land for Berea and $200 out of his own pocket. So again, this is really interesting about Cassius. Even though he disassociated from Berea for so many years, in his later age, he claimed to be the sole founder of Berea College, despite everything that Fee had done. But back to the day law. Does everybody know here about the day law? 1904, a law gets passed where Berea has to stop letting in black students and black faculty members. So the whole reason why Berea College got started in the first place, it had to end. I was about to say it could be a coincidence, but very rarely does history really have very many coincidences. Look at these dates here. So Fee dies 1901. And Cassius dies 1903, only 8 months before the day law gets passed. Basically, as soon as Cassius is dead and they're not worried about him pulling out his shotgun and walking outside of Whitehall, they pass the day law. So this is sort of an interesting thing. Even though Cassius and Fee did not get along very often, they still worked together. They helped start Berea, and if nothing else, their two personalities, together and separate, were incredibly strong. people did not mess with Cassius. People rarely messed with Fee, and if they did, they would often get a sermon about it. They would end up behind. So, people like John G. Fee and Cassius Clay were very rare in the state of Kentucky. It's crazy that these two people were here in Madison County together. There's only a couple of people like them in the whole state's history, and they were both in this area. So Madison County is really important in terms of understanding slavery, not only within Kentucky, but within the South. And the fact that you had two individuals like Fee and Cassius who did what they did and still somehow survived, I think is really important. And the fact that the day law happens as soon as these two men are out of the picture, I think it's kind of an important thing to sort of keep in mind. So, folks, I hope I didn't take too long here. I think it was about 45 minutes, but I want to thank everybody for coming here to the talk. And now I'm going to open it up in case anybody has any questions. I will try my best to be helpful and try to answer them. So, does anybody have any questions about anything? I see. Yes. Yeah.
So I noticed that, and I've heard in Fee's Bible there were scriptural passages torn out.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you know what was the criteria for what sort of made it into the Bible or not? I know that it's not necessarily to do with preservation, but
Right. So yes. So we've got a picture of Fee's cut Bible down in the archives, and we've talked about this down in the archives. We're not entirely sure why it's cut out. It's either there's a couple possible reasons. One possibility is that Fee might have disagreed about some things within the Bible and cut them out. People did that at the time. If you've ever read, there's the Thomas Jefferson Bible, where basically he did the same exact thing. He took the Bible and he cut pieces out, and he changed some things, and he's like, I don't agree with this, but this part makes sense. So this could have been what Fee did. Also, another possibility is that he had scriptures that were pivotal in terms of his opinions and his sort of points that he were making. So perhaps he cut out pieces of the Bible that he thought were the most important. Maybe he included them in the notes that he would bring around with him as well. So maybe he cut pieces out to sort of keep them with him at all times, even if he didn't have a Bible with him. So perhaps that's sort of the second reason too. So yeah, we're not entirely sure why the cut Bible is, but very clearly Fee is using the Bible. He's using it in a very powerful way. He has these pieces that he either disagrees with entirely or thinks that they're the most important parts of the whole book. So either or, yeah.
either way it's a canon.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
On that, are there more verses cut out than references to enslavement from the Old Testament? That was my understanding, is that you removed the verses referring to enslavement, and then of course, since it's two-sided, it cut out other verses too. Yeah. But that, at least you can see a little bit of that pattern in the Torah.
Yes. So it could very well be that he cut out the verses that had to do with slavery and made points that it was sort of excusable or okay, and maybe he just completely disagreed with it and thought this should not be in the Bible and cut them out. So that's definitely a possibility for sure. Did anybody else have any other questions? Yes.
During the section of time in Fee's life when he was going from church to church, he said once he preached, he was released.
Yeah, kicked out. Yeah.
And he hadn't started working for support. How was he living? What was he using financially for?
In terms of money, I don't really think he had a whole lot of money. He did have some money from his family. The relationship that Fee had with his father was really interesting. Once he becomes an anti-slavery advocate, his father got really upset and sort of denounced him. But then once Fee got married, his father tries to sort of come back into the picture, and they would spend time together, and Fee would be trying to preach to him the whole time, and his father would just sort of let him sort of say what he wanted. But from what I understand from his memoirs, I believe, he was getting some money from his family too. But then also there were anti-slavery people that he knew that were often sort of helping him out financially. He was part of anti-slavery societies, and I believe they would probably be helping fund him as he's trying to travel around and start his own congregation. So I don't think he had a lot of money, but I think he knew people who were like him, who were very passionate about ending slavery, who helped him out along the way before he sort of started his own congregation. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
So, Matthew, I'm trying to imagine that time in 1859 when they got run out.
Yeah, they fell out.
Off the ridge. But that model in the basement with the black, white, and model where everybody living next to someone from another race.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand, like, well, after people left, students left, faculty, staff left, like, who was here?
So there were still people living in Berea. Actually, 1862, when the Confederates invaded and come into Kentucky, Fee's wife was actually living here. Fee was gone. So basically, the community had started, and it was still a community. It's just that it no longer had the school. So I think there were still some people living here, but in terms of the people who worked at the school, they had all left and gone back up north. And Fee was also traveling around quite a lot as well. But it had started being a community, so there were farmers and there were people who knew Fee who didn't necessarily think that they had to leave, so they stuck around. So there were other people who stuck around. It's just that the school stopped and a lot of people did leave. It was nothing like what it had been by the time 1859 happened and everybody got kicked out. So there were still some people living here. It's just it was not a very, very strong, a very big community. Yeah. That answers your question. Yeah.
Just regard, there was a pretty good population of free blacks living here.
Okay, yeah. So there were still people who had come to Berea when it was a school and when when the school ended.
The school started.
Here before the school started. Okay. But yeah, does anybody else have any other questions or anything like that? Well, again, I appreciate everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Look for upcoming events. Thank you to Amanda and others, Sienna, who helped set up today. We'll hope to see you again soon.